Hey, happy Sunday and happy Mother's Day to the mothers. This week, we're going to work on some freeform crochet and a bit of embroidery and knitting. But first, I just want to talk about the materials that I'm using. I've chosen 9 colors of yarn, 9 colors of embroidery thread, 9 different textured yarns for embroidery, and a coordinating mixture of beads. You can use your own stash, and of course, each kit is available on my Etsy store called Myhre Designs. What you're seeing here is what I still have left after making the crochet mandala and the embroidery section for next week, and half of the motifs for this week. So you can see the kits are more than enough to make the entire box and then some. We'll probably be working on some bonus squares and a bonus mini project with what we have left over. In case you'd like a hole in the box for your knitting projects or anything else like earphone wires or charging wires or whatever else you can think of, we're going to start with that. But of course, you can skip this part if you're just making a storage box or a little project bag to carry. Starting with the back of the piece, find the vertical center space by counting 8 stitches on each side. As you can see, I'm just a little bit lower than the middle, about 7 spaces up from the bottom. And then just take a sharp scissor and clip the 2 bars on all sides of that center hole. And you can cut them clean to the line this time. Cut those little fringes off because we won't be putting the stress of crochet around it. We're just going to be stitching around it. And I know you see that there's all the extra little threads. Don't worry about clipping any of those because we're going to be doing so much stitching and things that all the seed stitching and the batting will definitely hold their place. So go ahead and cut away, and then once you have your grid square cut, go ahead and cut away the batting. And then once that's cut away, go ahead and cut the felt. Now, if you've used fabric that's not felt on the front, don't worry so much about that. You know, as long as it's not fraying like crazy, we're going to whip stitch around it and we're going to cover it, and it'll all be hidden inside the decorative piece that we're going to be putting on the front. So now you want to whip stitch along the sides to secure the front fabric to the grid, just to keep it from fraying and shifting. So all I have here is 2 strands of DMC floss, and I'm just working a very rough whip stitch, making sure I encase the grid side into the whip stitch. It is not pretty, but it's functional, and that's what matters right here. Now we'll get into the fun, pretty stuff. So let's work on the piece that covers up our yarn pull hole. Starting with the main yarn and a magic loop, we're going to crochet a basic circle. So when you put the yarn over your fingers, make sure that the tail crosses over the loop, so when you reach your hook in, the yarn you pull through covers both threads of the loop, and then you'll just make a chain to lock it in place. Then work 30 single crochets around the loop, making sure both yarns are inside each single crochet. That way when you pull the tail, you can adjust the circle. When you get back to the beginning, slip stitch into the very first single crochet you did to join it, and then cut the yarn, leaving about a 6-inch tail. Use the tail yarn to snug up the circle, and then use your hands to manipulate it into a consistent ring. Place the tail yarn onto a large needle and work it through the stitches in the back, just an inch or 2, and then just clip it. And then just to get a consistent flow of stitches across the top, you're going to thread the other end of the yarn, the one that you clipped when you finished. And before working it in, we'll work it into the next stitch just so we have, so the end doesn't have like a little lump there, essentially. So what you'll do is you'll slide the needle into the next grouping of stitches under both threads. And then when you bring it back around, you'll actually stab the needle into the stitch that your yarn is coming out of. I'm hoping this is clear in the photo, but if you just look at every stitch, they just look like little braids where there's 2 yarns coming out and then they chain to the next chain. So we're just trying to mimic that as best we can. And then bring your yarn to the back and clip it. take the ring and place it over the hole and just make sure that the fit is similar. The holes kind of match up. Don't worry about it if a bit of the background square peeks through that hole, because we're going to cover it all up later. But now we're going to make it really pretty by adding a beaded border around the ring. Here I'm using both size 6 and 8 seed beads. The key to what size needle to use is to have one small enough for the beads to go through, but large enough to hold the yarn. Now that I have the right needle, I've decided to use a size 5 pearl cotton. Weave the thread through a couple stitches on the back just to hold it in place, and then bring the needle from the back to the front in the back loops of one of the crochet stitches. Place a size 6 seed bead on the needle and bring the yarn through the back loop of the next stitch from back to front. Pull it up a little bit just to snug it up. Place another bead and repeat the stitch. So you're going to repeat that around the whole circle, and then at the end you should have 30 beads when it's finished. And if you have 29 or 31, sort of see if you can adjust it a little bit, because the next step about doing spokes, you need 30, because we're going to do 10 spokes. If you have 29 or 31, I would say just look around your ring to see maybe if you missed a stitch if you only have 29, or maybe you had an extra stitch that you can skip. I think it's just important just at the end to have 30 beads for the next row where we're going to have 10 spikes. Okay, and when you finish the beading, you're going to just stab the thread through the work to the back and then bring it through the next bead, and then string the whole thing again. In other words, pass your thread through each bead once again, and that'll make them sort of fall into place better. Now, if you have enough yarn to keep working, enough thread to keep working, then you can just keep going and do the spokes with that. Otherwise, you can weave that into the back, start a new thread, and then exit out of one of the beads and getting ready for the spokes. To do the spokes, just make sure that your thread is coming out of one of those size 6 beads. You're going to thread 3 size 8 beads, 1 size 6 bead, and then 3 more size 8 beads. Then pass the needle through the third bead from the one that you're exiting from the previous row. In other words, skip 2 beads to create the spoke, and then just enter into the bead, and then you're going to repeat that process all the way around. And then you'll have obviously 10 spokes, because we're doing it over every third bead. And then just weave the thread through the back and clip it. If you're using your own stash or shopping for the project, make sure that there's seed beads, because size 6 and 8 general beads will be a totally different size. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you know I use 12, 8, and 6 seed beads all the time, and they come in so many colors, so they're just really versatile and great to use. I generally have about 5 or 6 different types and sizes of needles, so I'm just ready to play with whatever that I have in front of me. And then to attach it to the piece, you're basically just going to use a small needle and some sewing thread or a couple strands of DMC floss to stitch the beaded frame in place. So you're going to hold it over the hole, just center it, come up from the back, right next to the top of the spoke, and then pass the needle through the size 6 bead at the top. Then come down straight through the fabric right next to the thread that you came up with, and then push it to the back, and then just kind of pull it to snug it up. Keep checking the frame to make sure that you have it in place, and then continue on to the next size 6 bead at the top of the next spoke, and then just continue around until it's attached to the background. Now I'm going to reach inside my beautiful project box and grab some yarn to do the branches. Here I'm using a sport weight white cotton yarn and a 2.5 millimeter hook. But use any hook that goes with your yarn that produces a nice solid branch. These branches can be worked freeform with any number of stitches, but I want a semi-symmetrical front, so I'm making 2 of the same. But obviously make these as large or small and as many as you want to do. You could do mirror image or not, just make it your own or follow along. Start by chaining 10 and slip stitching in the first 4, but don't go into the chain that the hook is coming from. Then chain 12, slip stitch in the next 3, chain 6, slip stitch in 5, skip the last stem and continue slip stitching in 3 more. Chain 14, slip stitch in 7, chain 12, slip stitch in 5. And then here we're going to do a little branch bump. All you're going to do is just chain 2, skip the 2 chains, and then continue on slip stitching in 5 more. Skip the little stem here and slip stitch into 3 more. Chain 5, slip stitch 4, and then slip stitch in 5 down the main stem. Skip the little stem there and slip stitch in 3 more. This is what's considered the main stem. Skip that last little stem and then slip stitch until you have 1 stitch left of the main stem. And then for the last branch, you're going to chain 10, slip stitch 3, we'll do another little bump, so chain 2, skip 2, slip stitch to the end. and then just clip it, pull the yarn through, weave the tails in, and then make another one if you're doing a mirror image like I am. If you're doing a more random background, play with the number of chains and slip stitches. There's really no wrong way to do these free-form branches, so they'll all work out, and it's just kind of fun to see what they end up looking like. The next bit of freeform crochet I want to show you are these loopy vines. Here I'm using the same size hook as I did the branches and a wool sport weight sock yarn. These are super easy. You start by chaining 7. Find the very first chain you did and work 3 double crochets into that chain. Then from there, you'll work a simple repeat, which is chain 6, work 3 double crochets into the center double crochet from the previous row. Continue working the chain 6 and the 3 double crochets in the center double crochet for as long as you want your piece to be. Here I stopped when I had 13 loops, and then of course I made 2 of these because I'm going for symmetry on this front piece. You can stop and use this as is, or work a couple of little puffs into some of the loops like I did. Here I'm using a yarn called Kid Silk Haze from Rowan. It's a tiny mohair strand and it creates a nice haze of color. So you'll start with a slip stitch into one of the loops and chain 3. Then you're going to work a treble crochet in the same loop, but don't pull the yarn through the last 2 stitches because we want to combine these at the top. So then you'll work another 3 treble crochet into the same loop right next to the last one, but on every single one, don't pull through the last 2. So as you can see with each treble crochet, you'll have 1 corresponding loop on the hook. So at the end, you'll have 5 treble crochets, including the original chain 3 at the beginning, and 5 loops on the hook. Yarn over and pull through all 5 loops. Take it slow and be patient here. You may have to pull down hard on the crochets, on the treble crochets, to get it through. And then once you do, chain 1 more time, and then cut the yarn and pull it through. Pull up on the puff to gather all the crochets together so it forms kind of a little arc, like a little popcorn. And then to finish off the ends, weave one end to the other. Tie a knot, and then weave them both up to the top of the puff and clip them. I worked these in every 3rd loop, and then I did one at the top in the middle of the double crochet cluster. The tops of these could have a huge flower too. You can weave this fine through different things. The possibilities are endless with all of these textured shapes and colors, so have fun with it and just play. Now let's do the focus fan flowers. Choose 4 coordinating yarns, and here I have a sport weight wool bamboo blend, and I'm chaining 15. Then work single crochets all the way down the stem to the last chain from the hook. In that chain, you're going to first chain 3 and then work 5 double crochets in the last stitch. Chain 3, and then work 2 double crochets in each of the next 4 double crochets. So that's 8 total. Work 1 double crochet into the last stitch, pull the yarn through and clip it. Here I have a black wool sock yarn. It's just a little bit lighter than the wool that I just used. With that, you're going to slip stitch in the first double crochet. Make sure the right side of the flower is facing you. Chain 6, slip stitch in the next double crochet, and just repeat that. Chain 6, slip stitch in the next double crochet. So you'll have 8 loops at the end, and then you can cut that color off. Still with the right side facing you, choose your third yarn. This is just a sport weight wool silk blend, I think. Then you're going to work behind the last row and join the new yarn with a slip stitch in the same stitch. So you'll kind of be pulling those little, where I have the black yarn, you'll be pulling those loops forward so that you can work into the backs of the stitch. You may have to, you can see what I'm doing here, you may have to pull the hook through and then just sort of see where you're going to go into. It's right next to the stitch from the previous row, so you're still using the same stitch from the main color, but it's behind the stitch, just so that those little black loops can stick out in front. We're not going to be working over those or anything. Okay, and then once you have that joined with the slip stitch, you're going to chain 7 and then slip stitch in the next double crochet next to the black loop from before. So it feels the same, where you're going to chain 7, slip stitch in the next double crochet, chain 7, slip stitch in the next double crochet, and then just make sure everything's forward. Then you can clip that yarn off and pull the yarn through. Then again with the right side facing, so we'll be working on the other end again, you're going to join your new color, which here I've got a kid mohair, a little bit heavier than the puffs that I did before, but of course anything goes here. You're going to slip stitch your new yarn on the slip stitch where I have the gray or wherever you have your third color. And then you're going to chain 9 and slip stitch in the next slip stitch. And then when you get to the last one, slip stitch in the very last slip stitch of the gray and cut it and pull the yarn through. And then just weave all of your ends in the back. Okay, now I want to show you one of my favorite little knitted leaves. You'll need about 4 feet of yarn. And here I'm using a size 2 needles and a luscious silk yarn by Carabella. One of the best things about this yarn is you can split it into 3 sections and knit 3 leaves with the same 4-foot section that you cut. And at $20 a skein, it's super economical. You can also embroider with this yarn as well, and it's one of my favorite yarns on the planet. Go slow when you untwine and let the yarn twist naturally as you pull it apart. Run your hand down the section a few times to straighten and cable cast on 5 stitches. The cable cast on is the greatest because the edge stays really solid. And if you haven't done that before, what you're going to do is place a slip stitch on your left needle and go in like you're going to knit. Pull the yarn through and twist the loop onto the left-hand needle. From here on out, you'll insert the needle between the stitches, pull the yarn through as before, and twist the loop onto the left-hand needle. When you have 5, go ahead and knit the first row. All wrong side rows on this leaf are worked knit 1, purl to the last stitch, knit 1. On the next right side knit row, we'll add a stitch on either side of the center stitch with a make 1, or as you'd see in a knitting instruction, M1. Spread your needles apart just a little bit and find the horizontal bar that sits right between them. Take your left-hand needle and insert it from front to back onto the needle. Then you'll knit through the back of the stitch. If you knit through the front, you'll have a hole, which sometimes is intentional. But in this case, I just wanted a solid little leaf. But if you want a hole, go ahead and knit through the front of it and you'll see what that looks like. The stitch count will be the same whether you knit into the front or the back, so it doesn't matter, it's more aesthetics. This is not to be confused with the knit front and back, or K, F, and B. So stitch count won't work if you interchange these increases. So if you're new to knitting and you see M1 in your instructions, this is how you'll do it. So the pattern would read, knit to the center stitch, make 1, knit 1, make 1, knit to the end. And then work your wrong side row, which was still knit 1, purl to the last stitch, knit 1. The next right side row, do the same thing, knit to the center stitch, make one, knit one, make one, knit to the end. Then work your wrong side row of the knit one, purl to the last stitch, knit one. Now for the decrease rows. So you'll knit one, SSK, which stands for slip, slip, knit. Slip 2 stitches one at a time knitwise onto your right hand needle. Insert the left hand needle into the fronts of these stitches from left to right and then knit them from this position. Then knit to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1. And the reason for the 2 different decreases is just strictly aesthetics. They'll lean in towards the center and look really nice. Then work your wrong side row, which again is knit 1, purl to the last stitch, knit 1. Next decrease row is the same. Knit 1, SSK, knit to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1. Then work your wrong side row. You should have 5 stitches, and for this row you'll work knit 1, knit 3 together, which is a P in the A when using cotton or silk, I admit. And then knit 1. Then turn it and purl the last 3 stitches together. Pull the loop through, and that's it. You've got your leaf. So make as many as you'd like to adorn your box. They're super quick and easy, and you can crochet up the sides with a different yarn, or you can embroider over the top of them. You can also use more yarn if you want to make bigger leaves. It's the exact same pattern. Just keep increasing until you have the size that you want, and then work your decrease rows. Okay, that is enough freeform pieces for now. Lay the motifs you've made out and just take a few photos. This is a great idea so that you can easily compare and also to get a further view from the piece. It's almost like looking at them from a design wall standpoint. I've chosen my layout and am now going to stitch these in place. The great thing about using cotton yarns is you can cut an 18-inch piece and then split them and then use one strand of the exact color of the motif to stitch. This works with wool sometimes too, depending on the twist of the yarn. Thread a sewing needle, tie a knot at the end, and holding the motif in place, make a few tacks up the branch. I just did it in the V's of the branch. I didn't sew it within an inch of its life because I wanted the option to leave some spaces so that I could tuck other motifs under and behind. If you're doing a symmetrical design, flip the second motif over and stitch it in place to mirror the first one. Get close, don't go crazy. This is just a very free-form sort of thing, so just eye it up and it'll be awesome. This is the method you'll use to lightly stitch all the motifs in place. Sewing thread or a strand of splittable yarn and a stitch every ½ inch or so will do. I'll probably add beads, or I might do some further embroidery on the motifs, so I know they'll be secure by the time I'm done with the side. And then, of course, be careful to stay clear of the edge stitches so that you don't run into trouble when you go ahead and join the squares together. Now that I have my bottom motifs on, I'm going to pin the fan flowers on the top so that I can embroider a bit in the background without them getting in the way. It's already pretty busy, so I'm going to work just a few things. The major embroidery we're going to do is next week. I'm really excited for that. I love how the embroidery turned out. But here, with the size 8 pearl cotton, I'm going to work a loose feather stitch. Come up where you want the top of your background vine to be. On either side of it, and 1/4 inch or so away, insert the needle back down into the fabric. Then come up in the center of these stitches, about 1/4 inch below, and make sure the needle is over the thread and pull through. I didn't worry about catching the grid on these at all. I'm just working through the fabric and the batting. From here, you're going to work the same stitch. You can switch sides whenever you like, work as many as you like, work them close together, farther apart. Since it's free form, there's really no right or wrong way. Just work it and enjoy it, and just use your instinct and make your vines how they'll fit into your motifs. Whoops, and as you can see here, I missed the loop, so it's no big deal if you do that. You can just pull up the little loop, insert your needle underneath, and then pull like you normally would, and that will make the little V stitch. So it happens. I think I just grabbed the needle on the wrong side of the thread. Okay, and then just come up aside it, maybe do a shorter one, then maybe do a longer one on the other side. With an 18-inch piece of thread, I got 3 little vines coming down on either side, and of course mirror it if you're doing symmetry. All I'm doing here is I've got a sewing thread and a teeny tiny little needle so that on every spoke of the feather stitch I can add a size 12 seed bead. They're really tiny little beads, but they actually make a pretty big impact. So sorry when my hands go off the screen. I try really hard not to do that, so I apologize if that is annoying. Okay, so here I want to do 3 daisies. So this is where I lose the symmetry a little bit. I just want 3 daisies coming up the center. A French knot is when you come up, you're going to hold the yarn taut and take your needle and wrap it 3 or 4 times. Then the trick of the French knot is to take the yarn that's in your left hand or right hand if you're left hand dominant, wrap it under the needle, and then stab the needle right back in right next to where the thread is coming out. Hold everything in place and slowly pull it until it forms a nice little perfect knot. Start with 3 strands of DMC floss and work a cluster of French knots, 3-4 wraps, probably 5 or 6 together, and I'm just going to establish the center of the flowers. So as you can see, I've got the center of my flowers established, and then I had some extra leftover yarn, so I just did a dot, 1 French knot, maybe in 5 different places, just to reference that color again. It's not going to be noticeable, but it does add a little bit to the piece. We're going to use the sparkly thread for the daisy petals. And here's a little tip. When you take a piece of thread, run your finger and your thumb lightly down the thread, and whichever side feels smoother, that's the side that you're going to want to put on the needle, because when it goes through the fabric, the twist will work with you instead of getting all crumpled up if you have the needle on the wrong end of the thread. Work just some very loose lazy daisy stitches. They're just long lazy daisies. So you're going to come up next to your French knot cluster and then go down right next to it, and then before you pull it all the way through, bring the needle from behind up front, maybe an inch away. And you're going to insert your needle back into the fabric over the loop. So make sure you catch that loop in that little stitch, and that'll hold it in place. Basically, then you're just going to come up right next to it and keep making petals side by side. When you're working straight out from the piece, you'll notice that there's more space between the tips of the petals than at the base. Obviously, just because we're working on a circular angle. This first flower, I did a half flower just because it kind of looked like it wanted to be that as I was stitching. So I like the effect of that. And then for the other two flowers, I just worked regular daisies with the petals that go all the way around. And I kind of wanted them to touch and intermingle a little bit. So I overlapped one with the other just on two petals. Okay, and so with all of that background embroidery, I decided it's time to sew on the fan flowers. So same kind of thing. You're just going to take your single strand of the yarn or a thread that's close in color and begin stitching it on. And you can see I didn't pin it or anything. I'm just holding it in place, every 1/4 inch up the stem. Where it twisted, I just let it twist. The first one you can just sew on really the way that you want it to, but when it comes time to sew the mirror image on, you'll just want to be a little bit more careful just to eye it up and make sure that it looks similar, it's a mirror image of the one before. And then I just kept sewing up the side, and then for the center I knew I wanted to put bead stitches. See where the little gray stitches are poking out. I knew I wanted to put size 6 beads. So under every single little black loop will sit a bead, and that's just a matter of same yarn and everything, putting a size 6 bead on and then going through the bead twice just so it's secure, and then obviously do the same thing for the flower on the other side. Next, let's give these little floating daisies a home. So what I've got here is a sport weight wool yarn. I'm going to come up just under, like between 2 petals under the, the center of the stitch. I'm going to work a stem stitch. So the secret to this is come up from the back and about 1/4 of an inch away, go back down, and then come up through the middle of those 2 stitches. Make sure that you're always keeping the yarn on the left side or the bottom if you're looking at it in that way. And then insert the needle, come back up where the old stitch went up, and then you'll still always be in the center of those 2, and it creates this really pretty braid. The secret to a curvy stem stitch is the deeper the curve, the shorter the stitches should be. This is a really gentle curve, so I'm kind of just following along. I'm using my needle every time I insert it just to eye it up and make sure that the stem is going to stay at a slight curve. Then I'm going to do a fishbone stitch, which is coming up just before the center. Go down through the center into the side of the stitch. Insert the needle back down below and come up on the other side at the same level. Insert the stitch down below. You see what I'm doing there? I'm just bringing the yarn up on either side, and it creates this braided leaf that's really pretty, and I love it in the yarn. Kind of reminds me of crewel or something very 70s, which I'm always a huge fan of since I was born in 1970. I'm a 70s baby. So just kind of work that down until you get to the stem, and that just looks great. And then just work stems on a gradual curve on the other 2 flowers. Just eye it up, and you can envision what that stem might look like, and there is no wrong here, so just play with it. What I'm doing here in these little fan flowers, I'm just doing little stab stitches underneath where the crochet bumps are and just working them down back into the bead just for a little bit of extra color and texture. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, I did put a larger, more focused bead right at the base of the fan flower where I'm putting the little stab stitches in. Okay, now I want to show you how to cut the hole out of the lining fabric so that you can actually pull the yarn from the inside of the box. Put the fabric on the back of the piece and just eye it up around all the sides to make sure that the lining of the fabric matches your edging, just so that there's a semi, as close as you can, equal distance from the stitches to where the top of your lining is, and just clip it or pin it in place. Flip it over, and with any marker or pencil you choose, just draw the outline of the square, as you can see here. And then unclip it, take your lining fabric, bend it in half, and put a little slit, cut a little slit in the hole. And then just take your scissor and cut it around your tracing mark. And you can round that too a little bit just to get the the edges a little bit more rounded. It really won't matter because we're going to be stitching around it all anyways. Okay, and now comes the Netflix binge-worthy part. Take 2 strands of the main yarn, and we're going to stitch the inside of the circle all the way back to the lining so that you have a fluid yellow, in my case yellow, yarn going all the way through the back. You can tie a little knot at the ends of the 2 strands, and in between the lining and the front, insert your needle so that the knot gets hidden in the back. What you want to do is make sure that you can push the needle down through the front and come out the back. That way you're ensured that the front always looks really good. You're always putting the needle in the exact same spot around the circle. You can see where I'm inserting the needle is to mimic the lines of the bottom of the crochet stitches and underneath those horizontal bars. And when you stick your needle through, make sure you're coming all the way through and through the back of the fabric. And then you want to pop the needle right back up through the hole so that you can place another stitch right next to it under that horizontal bar. I know that's hard to see, so sorry. I will watch for that, I promise. But you see what I'm doing is I'm putting the stitches right next to each other so that you can have that nice color of yellow that goes all the way through. And then on the back, you just make sure that the stitches are coming out right next to the stitches that you did previously. If you want something extra over the top of this piece, you can do what I did here is I just made another ring out of the main yarn like we did in the beginning of the video, and this time I only did like 22 stitches, I think 20, 22, 24. Made that ring, and then I've got the black sock yarn and a small hook, and I'm just doing single crochets in every stitch with a chain 3 in between them. Kind of makes a cute little ruffle. And then to stitch it on, I've come up through the back of the ring with a single strand of the yarn, and I'm just following the little horizontal bars. Just pick a place to stitch and stay consistent, and then reach behind and pick up the inside stitch next to one of the beads. Now obviously this isn't going to be stitch for stitch because we have 30 stitches on the large ring and like 20 something on the small ring, so just work it directly across from where the stitch is coming out from the small ring. It really won't matter. We're just attaching it. And then once it's attached, you can kind of pull the ruffles forward and gather it, and it looks kind of like a poppy center. It's really pretty. Okay, I think this video is getting pretty long, so I'm going to stop here. I might play with it a little bit. I haven't put my gold leaves on it yet. I might make a few more pieces, and if I do, I'll give you the heads up in the next video. And then also, I'm going to show you how to clip the little fringes on the edge, stitch around the felt or the fabric, whatever you used on the front piece, to get it really secure, and then also to stitch the background. Next week we're going to work the embroidery mandala. So you're going to want to gather like all your different embroidery threads and the colors that go with your piece, a hoop, the background fabric, and then a piece of batting. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I had so much fun thinking about all of you stitching along with me. Make sure you post pictures of the work that you've done on Mandala Unplugged on Facebook, because we all want to see what you're doing and what colors you're using. And hit me up with any questions. I'll be watching for you. Thanks again so much. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next Sunday.